welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm doing the big books tag. I wasn't actually tagged in this tag, but I did just see Sandy from Miss Reads a Lot do this tag, and I really wanted to do it too because I really love big books a lot, and we are almost finished with March of the Mammoths, and I've been reading through a couple of mammoths this month, and so I just wanted to share with you this tag and just talk about some of the massive books that I currently have on my shelves. So the idea for this tag is super simple. Basically, all you need to do is share 5 really large books that you have read, and then 2 on your shelves that you have not yet read. So for the sake of this tag, I am only including books that I actually do own for both components of this tag, but there are some big books I've read that I do not own. So I'm not including any of these. These are just ones that I own. Also, I know that everyone has different editions of books, so my page count numbers may be totally different than yours, which might make my biggest book maybe not the same as your biggest book, but I'm going off of my physical page counts of what I have on my shelves because that is just easier than trying to look up Goodreads or whatever else. Okay, so let's start with the biggest books that I've ever read. And I'm pretty sure that this book is literally the biggest, longest book that I have ever read. And that's Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. My edition clocks in at 1,416 pages. So it's a pretty hefty book. I love this one though. I read this about 1.5 years ago, and it's one of those big scary books that I was determined to conquer. And so that was the book, the big scary book that I chose to conquer in 2021. And I read it with a group of people and absolutely loved it and felt like it was 1000% worth all of the effort that it took to read it and felt so connected to it. So if you're scared of Les Mis, don't be. It's wonderful and it's totally worth it. The next big book that I have on this list is the big scary book that I decided to tackle last year in 2022, and that's Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. I'm actually not sure. This one is less, 1,350 pages in this edition. So in this edition, it's like 75 pages less than my edition of Les Mis, but I've seen some people where War and Peace is longer than Les Mis in the editions that they have. So just gonna totally depend on the editions. My Les Mis edition is like the Penguin's Anniversary edition, and then this is the Oxford edition for War and Peace. So this was my big scary book last year, and I didn't feel like the payoff was as good as Les Mis was, though I still did enjoy it. I'm glad I read it. Will probably reread it at some point in my life, but Les Mis is marvelous, and War and Peace was actually harder for me. So the next classic I have on here is one that is just barely over 1,000 pages in my edition, but I think it's because the print is very, very small because most people's edition of this book, when it is an unabridged version, is around 1,200 pages, and that is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. I love this book. This was like my favorite book as a teenager. I was always saying, this is my favorite book of all time. If I have to choose one book, it's this one. And I did just reread this last year. Would not still say it is one of my favorites of all time, but it's still got a solid 5-star rating from me. And I did just buy last year this beautiful word cloud edition that has quotes kind of embossed in there, and it's got one on the back as well. Just a lovely edition. I really love it. Next up, we are shifting away from classic literature and into fantasy with The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I read this one last year for the very first time. I was putting it off for a really long time because despite the fact of tackling books like War and Peace and Les Miserables, I was very intimidated by a fantasy book that clocks in at 1,001 pages. But I read this last year and I loved it so much. I have not yet continued on with the Stormlight Archive, even though I do own the next 3 books in the series, but I absolutely love this one. I had read some of Brandon Sanderson before, his entire original Mistborn trilogy, so I probably shouldn't have been concerned, but still just the size of the book was really intimidating to me, but I'm super glad that I read this one. And for my last of the 5 books on my shelves that I've read that are the biggest books, It's kind of tricky to say because I have a lot of Dickens books on my shelves, and some of them I thought were going to be longer. Like I thought David Copperfield might be his longest, or maybe Our Mutual Friend, but based on the page counts of the editions that I own, my largest Dickens that I own is Little Dorrit. And this one comes in at 985 pages. Our Mutual Friend and Bleak House were actually really close to this, not very far away. They were, I think, both also in the 900s, but this one just squeaked it out by just a few pages. So Little Dorrit, it's been a while since I've read this one. I have read it, and I actually read it when my daughter was really little and I had my wisdom teeth out, and when I was recovering from that, I actually read this book in just a couple of days during my wisdom tooth recovery because I couldn't do hardly anything else. And so I really love Little Dorrit. I'm probably about due for a reread on this one. So now we're going to get into books on my shelves that are really big that I have not yet read, and I have more than 2 books here, so I hope that that is okay with you. The longest book that I have on my shelves that I still have yet to read that I really want to read is Don Quixote, and I am actually reading this in May, I think. So this will be read very soon, so I almost didn't include it for that reason. This particular edition clocks in at 1,026 pages. I think that oftentimes this book can be longer depending on the editions, but this is, it feels not quite so scary because it's so short and so small. The print is like extremely tiny, but that's fine. I love these Macmillan collector editions. They're really pretty because not only are the covers pretty, gilded edges, bookmark, but like the fronts are like embossed, and they're very pretty. So I am looking forward to checking this one off my list this year. So I was purposely not including books that were anthologies on this list or collections of authors' works because it's not just one book. So like I have a collection of all of Shakespeare's works, and that's really long. But this one I am going to include anyway, despite the fact that this is technically 3 books in one, because I know a lot of people that have a bind up of all 3 together and they read all 3 together, and that is Kristen Lavrenstatter by Sigrid Undset. And I don't have plans to read this year, possibly next year. I actually won this in a giveaway also from Sandy from Miss Reads a Lot, and I'm so excited because I have had this book on my wish list for forever, and I've never had access to a library that has this book on file, so I'm really excited to have it. This particular edition has all 3 books in it and clocks in at 1,144 pages, so this one is technically longer than Don Quixote, again, depending on the edition, but this does have like 3 books that are in one. I have a really huge nonfiction that I want to include on this list. This is one that I would like to start soonish. I've read little bits of it, but it's one that's probably going to take me a long time to read, and that is Dostoevsky, A Writer in His Time by Joseph Frank. This is like the most comprehensive biography on Dostoevsky that you can get, and if you've been on my channel for a little while, you know that Dostoevsky is quite possibly my favorite writer of all time. It's hard for me to really say that though. He's one of my favorites for sure, but how do you choose a favorite writer of all time? I don't really know. But anyways, this particular book clocks in at 959 pages. And the biggest reason why I think it's going to take me a long time to read this, besides the size, is the fact that there are chapters dedicated to different books that he has written, and they are spoilery about the books that he has written. So I don't want to read those chapters until I have read works of his that I have not yet gotten to. So far, I think I only have one more major work of Dostoevsky to get to, but then there are some very well-known novellas and short stories that are referenced in here as well that I would also like to get to before I read that. I could still read beginning parts of it though, like about the beginning of his life, so I guess I don't have an excuse for not having started it yet. I also have a lot of lengthy sci-fi and fantasy books that are on my shelves that I hope to read. The most notable one is probably Words of Radiance, and this is book 2 after The Way of Kings in the Stormlight Archive. This one's a little bit longer and clocks in at 1,097 pages in this edition, but I'm pretty sure that the most recent one, I think around 1,200 pages. So I think that that's the longest one. That's book 4 in the Stormlight Archive. So I do have some longer Brandon Sanderson still to get to for sure. And then I have some other ones that are, you know, kind of lengthy and in like the 800 page mark. But then I have one that's about 850 pages long. And that's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I have not read any Susanna Clarke. I haven't read Piranesi either, which I've heard wonderful things about both of them. I've heard that this is very Dickensian in its feel, and then it has, you know, magic as well, which is like, sounds heavenly to me. So I really do want to read this one and have not yet gotten to it, again, because of its size. You know, that kind of makes me kind of balk when it comes to fantasy, which is funny because size does not make me balk when it comes to classic literature. But when it comes to fantasy, size and scope scares me just a little bit. So this is one that is on my list that I really want to read. I don't know. I probably won't get to it this year because I'm trying really hard to catch up on series. And so I am trying to read the Stormlight Archive. I am reading through the Farseer trilogy, which those are pretty big as well. So we'll see when I get to this one. Might not be till next year, but this is probably the next largest fantasy book that I have on my shelves. I also have like the first book of, what is it? Is it the King Killer or King Slayer Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss? I have the first book of that. I have the first book of the Wheel of Time series. I have Dune. So I have several books that are on the larger side, but I'm trying really hard not to start a bunch of brand new massive fantasy series until I make some progress in the other big fantasy series that I've already started. So there you have it. There are some of the very large books on my shelves, some of which I have read, some of which I hope to read sooner rather than later, hopefully. But I love big books, and there's something so satisfying about finishing a book that you've invested a lot of time in. I just love big books. Honestly, the bigger the better most of the time, because it means that I get to spend more time with the characters and more time connecting with them. So if I like the writing style and I like the author and I like the characters, I rarely feel like a book is too long. There are exceptions to that, but oftentimes length is not my biggest complaint when it comes to books. I suppose that is evidenced by the fact that, you know, I did just finish Demons by Dostoevsky, which is around 700 pages. I'm currently working my way through Gone with the Wind, which is around 1,000 pages, and Middlemarch, which I think is 700, 800 pages, something like that, and also a Robin Hobb book. So I am in the middle of all the big books right now, and I love it. I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. What is the biggest book that you have read? And is there a book that's on your TBR that's really big that you were either intimidated by or that you're really excited by? Either one, I think, is fine. Sometimes you can be both, right? Because that's how I felt about The Way of Kings. I was excited about it, but also intimidated by it. And so I think that you can be both at the same time. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me. And I will see you again next time.